June 19, 1944. The Pacific sky is calm. Too calm. Beneath that still horizon, hundreds of men prepare for a storm unlike any before. Engines rumble, fuel burns, and across 15 miles of ocean, the U.S. Navy readies its strike. Then, on the distant edge of radar, blips begin to appear. Dozens, then hundreds. Within minutes, 400 Japanese aircraft rise into the dawn. A single day that will decide the fate of the Pacific, a battle so lopsided it defied belief. In the chaos that followed, entire squadrons vanished before they even reached the American fleet. What happened that morning wasn't just a clash of steel and sky. It was the moment Japan's air power died. A day when skill, courage, and technology collided in a storm of fire that changed the course of history. This is the true story of the great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the day 400 planes vanished into the Pacific sky. If you love uncovering the hidden stories behind history's most decisive moments, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It helps this channel bring forgotten battles back to life and lets you step inside the cockpit of history's most incredible moments. Now, buckle in. The engines are roaring, and our story is about to take flight. The Pacific stretched endless and blue, a mirror of deceptive calm. To the men aboard Task Force 58, that stillness was unsettling because they knew what it meant. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Japan was gathering its strength. June 1944. The U.S. Navy had clawed its way across the Pacific island by island, reef by reef, bleeding for every mile. Saipan was next, Japan's last defensive wall before the home islands. To break it would be to expose Tokyo itself. But victory would come at a cost, and every sailor, every pilot, every deckhand felt the weight of that truth in their bones. The air smelled of fuel and salt, and the hum of engines vibrated through steel decks like a heartbeat. Something was coming, something vast. 3 years earlier, that same sea had been ruled by the rising sun. The Japanese Zero had been untouchable, swift, elegant, and merciless. American pilots once looked to the sky with dread, knowing the odds were against them. But now, the tide had shifted. The men of Task Force 58 weren't just armed with better planes. They carried the momentum of an empire reborn through grit and industry. 15 carriers lined the horizon, their decks bristling with sleek blue Hellcats. For the first time in the Pacific War, the U.S. fleet wasn't the hunted, it was the hunter. And yet, beneath that confidence, there lingered something else. Doubt. Because no matter how powerful the machine, every battle still came down to the man in the cockpit, staring death in the face and pulling the trigger first. On the night before the battle, the ocean was black glass. Stars burned above like cold embers. Pilots walked the decks in silence, some joking quietly, others lost in thought. Lieutenant Commander David Harrington leaned against the rail, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. He was young, but the war had aged him fast. In his first tour, he'd flown the stubby, underpowered Wildcat, barely a match for the Zero. He'd lost friends, watched them spiral into the sea in flames, and survived only by chance. Now, his fighter was the Hellcat, a beast forged from every lesson written in blood. He ran a gloved hand along its armored skin earlier that evening, feeling its promise of survival. Tomorrow he would test that promise, and though he'd flown dozens of missions, this one felt different. History was coiling, ready to strike. By dawn, the horizon bled orange. Engines thundered to life. The steel decks trembled beneath hundreds of aircraft warming up in unison. Across the fleet, signal flags snapped in the wind, and the smell of oil hung heavy in the humid air. Harrington stood beside his wingman, Samuel Ortiz, a kid barely out of flight school with nerves of steel and a grin that masked his fear. "You think they'll really come in that heavy?" Ortiz asked, his voice half curiosity, half disbelief. Harrington just nodded. "They have to. They've got nowhere left to run." Over the radio, A calm voice echoed through the fleet. Admiral Mark Mitcher's order. All pilots to stations. This is it, gentlemen. Eyes open. Above the rising sun, the calm Pacific sky shimmered like glass. Within hours, it would burn. 3 years before the sky over the Marianas turned to fire, the Pacific belonged to Japan. December 7th, 1941, the day the world shifted on its axis. In less than 2 hours, Japan's air arm tore through Pearl Harbor like a blade through silk. Battleships burned, hangars exploded, and the once invincible U.S. Pacific Fleet was left crippled in its own harbor. For America, the shock was more than physical. It was spiritual. The Zero fighter, sleek and ghostly, seemed almost supernatural. It could outturn, outclimb, and outfight anything the Americans had. To the men who faced it, the Zero wasn't a machine. It was a phantom. Pilots described it as if it could dance on air. Against such an enemy, even courage felt small. The early months of war were a nightmare written in smoke and salt water. At Wake Island, at the Coral Sea, over the Philippines, American pilots fought in underpowered wildcats that felt like toys against the elegant predators of Japan. They died in droves, often before they even saw their attacker. Radios filled with static and last words. And yet, even in those darkest months, something began to change. The Americans studied. They learned. Every shattered fuselage and lost pilot became data. Every weakness of the Zero, its fragile frame, its lack of armor, its vulnerability in a dive, was noted, dissected, and turned into a blueprint for vengeance. The war was no longer about pride. It was about adaptation. In secret workshops across the United States, engineers at Grumman Aircraft built a fighter not of beauty, but of brute force. They listened to the men who had survived encounters with the Zero. "Don't try to turn with it," one pilot said. "Hit it hard, dive, and get the hell out." The new design reflected that philosophy. Armor around the cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks, 650 caliber machine guns, a monster engine. This plane wouldn't dance. It would punch. It would take hits and still fly. It would be simple enough for a rookie, deadly enough for an ace. That philosophy gave birth to the F6F Hellcat, a fighter forged in anger and designed to win ugly. By 1943, the first Hellcats took to the Pacific skies, and everything began to change. The Zero's reign of terror started to crumble. For the first time, Japanese pilots found themselves outgunned, outnumbered, and outflown. The hunter had become the hunted, but the scars of Pearl Harbor lingered. Every American pilot who strapped into a Hellcat carried them like ghosts in the cockpit, memories of friends lost in that first devastating attack. The ghosts of Pearl Harbor weren't gone. They simply flew alongside, whispering reminders of why the fight had to be won. And as the sun rose over the Marianas in June 1944, those ghosts were about to be avenged. In a quiet corner of Long Island, far from the gunfire and the ocean's edge, a group of engineers at Grumman Aircraft worked day and night in 1942. The walls were thin, the pressure immense, and every sketch drawn on the drafting table felt like a matter of life or death. The men weren't just designing an airplane, they were designing redemption. The Navy had one demand: build us a fighter that can survive. They didn't need another lightweight marvel like the Zero. They needed a brute, a plane that could take a beating, keep flying, and bring its pilot home. Thus, the F6F Hellcat was born, not as a symbol of elegance, but of endurance. It was the muscle and the metal embodiment of America's industrial soul. From the moment the first Hellcat rolled off the line, pilots knew it was different. It wasn't graceful. It was powerful. A steel giant with an engine that roared like a thunderclap. Inside, the cockpit was armored like a fortress, the fuel tanks sealed against flame. The wings hid 6 heavy machine guns that could turn a sky into a wall of lead. And yet, despite its strength, it handled with surprising ease. Rookie pilots could master it quickly. Veterans could push it to its limits. The Hellcat wasn't built for acrobatics. It was built to survive the knife fight of aerial war. It was the difference between burning out and coming home. When the Hellcat first reached the fleet in late 1943, it didn't take long to prove itself. In the skies over the Marshall Islands, over Truk Lagoon, and in raids deep into Japanese-held territory, the Hellcat tore through enemy formations. Reports came in of kill ratios unheard of, 12-1, 14-1, sometimes higher. Pilots returned with bullet holes stitched across their fuselage, yet the engine still roared, the wings still held. To men who had once flown the fragile Wildcats, the Hellcat felt like a promise kept. One pilot said, "It's not a plane, it's a guardian angel with claws." Behind this new power was something Japan could never match: American industry. While Japanese factories struggled to replace even a few dozen aircraft each month, the United States was building thousands. Training schools churned out pilots with 300 flight hours before they ever saw combat. Japan's pilots were down to 50. The math was merciless. The Hellcat wasn't just a fighter, it was a system, a symbol of industrial dominance and adaptation. And when those deep blue wings finally filled the Pacific sky, it marked more than a turning point. It marked a reckoning. The Hellcat had arrived, and the age of the Zero was already ending. War, in the end, isn't only fought with bullets, it's fought with factories, with training, with time. By 1944, America had become a war machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. Entire cities pulsed to the rhythm of production lines. In Detroit, the same factories that once built cars now turned out aircraft engines by the thousands. In California, aluminum wings gleamed beneath endless assembly lights. Women filled the hangars, riveting metal under the glow of welding torches. Every bolt tightened, every panel sealed, every aircraft shipped across the ocean carried not just a pilot, but a piece of the nation that built it. The United States wasn't just fighting with soldiers anymore, it was fighting with momentum. Across the Pacific, Japan's story was very different. What had once been an empire of confident expansion was now a nation stretched thin, its resources bleeding away. Factories were bombed, fuel was scarce, and the few remaining veterans were irreplaceable. Japan's training schools shortened their programs, desperate to fill cockpits with anyone who could fly. Some pilots were sent into battle with barely 50 hours in the air. The difference between them and their American counterparts, who had trained for hundreds of hours on powerful simulators under relentless instructors, was catastrophic. For every one experienced Japanese ace, there were a dozen American pilots ready to meet him head-on. The balance of skill and numbers had flipped, and with it, the fate of the Pacific War. The scale of America's industrial mobilization bordered on the impossible. In 1943 alone, U.S. factories produced more aircraft than Japan had built in the entire war so far. Supply ships moved across the ocean like a steel conveyor belt, feeding the fleet with fuel, food, and ammunition. Carriers like floating cities refueled and rearmed in open water, something Japan had never mastered. It wasn't just a navy, it was an ecosystem, a self-sustaining force that could strike anywhere at any time and keep fighting indefinitely. For every Hellcat that fell into the sea, 2 more were already being loaded onto a transport ship in San Francisco. For every pilot lost, another was graduating from flight school, ready to take his place. The United States had learned the cold, relentless truth of modern war. Victory belonged to those who could replace faster than they could lose. And so, by mid-1944, Japan found itself standing at the edge of a precipice. The once invincible Zero was now outmatched, outnumbered, and outdated. The Empire's proud air arm was cracking under the pressure of attrition. Still, they fought on, driven by pride, by duty, by the belief that one last great strike could turn the tide. That strike would come soon, over the Mariana Islands. What the Japanese didn't yet know was that their final gamble would not just fail, it would erase their air force from the sky. The engines were already warming, the fleets were already moving, and history was closing in. The machine of war was about to reveal its full, merciless power. June 18, 1944, the night before the storm. The Pacific was a sea of quiet steel. From horizon to horizon, 15 American carriers drifted under a velvet sky, their decks glowing faintly in the starlight. To an outsider, it might have seemed peaceful, but peace has a sound, and this wasn't it. Beneath the surface calm, every ship hummed with tension. Mechanics tightened bolts and loaded ammunition belts. Pilots ran through checklists by the dim glow of red lamps. On the bridge of the USS Lexington, Admiral Mark Mitcher stood motionless, hands clasped behind his back, watching the radar screens flicker. Somewhere out there, beyond the black horizon, Japan was coming. Not in whispers, not in shadows, but in force. Intelligence reports painted a chilling picture. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa was assembling nearly 400 aircraft across 9 Japanese carriers, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, all poised for one desperate counterattack. To the Japanese high command, this was their last hope to turn the tide, to crush the American invasion of the Marianas before it reached Japan's doorstep. To Mitcher and his men, it was something else entirely, the moment they'd been waiting for since Pearl Harbor. In the dark, radio operators exchanged brief bursts of code. Every man aboard knew what was coming, and every man understood the stakes. The next sunrise would decide who owned the Pacific sky. Lieutenant Commander David Harrington barely slept. He lay in his narrow bunk, the distant drone of engines echoing through the steel hull. Around him, pilots whispered quietly, trading jokes that didn't quite hide their fear. His wingman, Samuel Ortiz, had fallen asleep sitting upright, helmet still in his lap. Harrington smiled faintly. Ortiz was young, too young maybe, but his nerve was unshakable. They'd flown together for months, through chaos and close calls, and tomorrow would be their greatest test. In his mind, Harrington replayed the training, the drills, the advice from old veterans. Stay high, hit hard, never turn with a zero. He'd repeated it so often it had become a prayer. Somewhere deep down he knew. Once the battle began, there would be no time for prayers. Just before dawn, the fleet came alive. Engines roared to life, their thunder rolling across the ocean like distant artillery. Deck crews moved with the precision of muscle memory, fueling, arming, launching scouts into the gray morning haze. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and seawater. Over the radio, a calm voice crackled through the static. All pilots to stations. Prepare for immediate launch orders. Harrington pulled on his flight gloves and stepped onto the deck. The sky was still dark, but a thin line of orange light bled across the horizon. He looked at Ortiz and nodded once. This is it. Ortiz grinned, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. Let's make it count, Skipper. And as the first Hellcat engines roared to full power, the sun began to rise, slow, red, and foreboding. The calm before the fire was over. Somewhere out there, 400 enemy aircraft were already climbing into the dawn. The greatest carrier battle in history was only hours away, and the men of Task Force 58 were about to meet their destiny head-on. The first warning came at 8:30 a.m., faint radar blips materializing like ghosts on the edge of the screen. Multiple bogies, bearing 270 degrees, range 150 miles. The words snapped through the Combat Information Center like a live wire. Every man froze for a fraction of a second. Then the ship erupted into motion. Alarms blared across the decks. Orders echoed through the corridors. Launch all fighters! On every carrier of Task Force 58, the ritual began. Wings unfolded, engines screamed, catapults slammed forward. One by one, the Hellcats leapt into the sky, blue steel soaring toward the rising sun. Among them was Lieutenant Commander David Harrington, his gloved hands tight on the controls, heart pounding in rhythm with the roar of his engine. Beside him, Ortiz gave a quick salute, a grin flickering beneath his oxygen mask. Then they climbed, higher and higher, into the growing light. From 15,000 feet up, the Pacific looked deceptively serene. But on the horizon, darkness was spreading. Dozens of tiny dots were taking shape, then hundreds, an approaching storm of Japanese aircraft. Zeros, dive bombers, torpedo planes, all moving in tight formation, glinting in the morning sun. "There they are," Harrington muttered. The radio crackled with the calm voice of Commander Frank Dalton. "All units, intercept, boom and zoom, stay out of turning fights, make every burst count." That was the doctrine. Strike fast, climb away, live to strike again. As the enemy drew closer, the air grew tense, heavy, electric. Ortiz's voice broke the silence. "That's a lot of planes, Skipper." Harrington's reply was steady, almost cold. "Then we've got work to do." The two formations collided with the force of a hurricane. The sky exploded in tracers and smoke trails. Hellcats dove from above, their guns roaring, ripping through Japanese formations before the enemy even knew they were there. The first Zero went up in flames, then another. Bombers fell burning into the sea, their payloads detonating mid-air in blossoms of fire. Harrington locked onto a torpedo plane, squeezed the trigger. 6 heavy machine guns erupted in unison. The bomber disintegrated, a fireball vanishing into the waves below. "Splash one!" he called out, climbing again. Ortiz's voice followed through the static. "Got another, Judy! She's done!" But even amid the chaos, danger stalked them. Zeros swooped from above, desperate to drag the Hellcats into tight turns where agility still mattered. One latched onto Harrington's tail, bullets stitching across his wing. He rolled hard left, dove, felt the G-forces crush his chest. The Zero followed. Too eager, too close. Harrington pulled up sharply, climbing through the cloud layer. The enemy stalled, hanging helpless in the air. One burst, one flash, gone. For 40 minutes, the Pacific sky was an inferno. Dozens of dogfights unfolded at once, stretching across 30 miles of sky. The Japanese attack had become chaos. Formations shattered, radio discipline gone. Some pilots fought bravely to the end. Others broke away in panic. But the outcome was inevitable. When the first wave finally broke apart, over half of Japan's attacking force was gone. Only a handful of bombers reached the American fleet, and none survived the wall of anti-aircraft fire that greeted them. From the deck of the USS Lexington, Admiral Mitcher watched through binoculars as black smoke pillars rose on the horizon. Around him, officers murmured in disbelief. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. And above that smoking ocean, Harrington and Ortiz flew through the drifting wreckage. Silent now, their radios filled only with static. The sky had ignited, burned bright with fire and courage, and now it was eerily calm again. But the battle was far from over. Another storm was coming, larger, deadlier, relentless. And when it arrived, the Pacific would burn all over again. The first wave was over, but there was no time to celebrate. The radio came alive again with new coordinates, urgent and clipped. Multiple enemy formations inbound, estimated strength over 100 aircraft. The second wave was coming. Harrington checked his fuel and ammunition, still good. He looked out across the sky where plumes of smoke marked the graves of the first attack. "Round 2, Ortiz said over the radio, his voice breathless but steady. "Think they've got any fight left?" Harrington replied, "They've got enough to die trying." Below them, the Pacific shimmered with wreckage. Flames danced on the water, yet far to the west, dark specks were already forming again, more planes rising into the sun. They were coming, and nothing was going to stop them. When the two forces met, the sky turned into a storm of sound and color. The second wave was larger, more desperate. A black tide of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes charging straight toward Task Force 58. The Hellcats dove to meet them like hawks falling on prey. The first passes were brutal. Tracers lit the air in streaks of orange. Explosions rolled across the sky like thunder. Harrington lined up on a Val dive bomber just as it began its attack run. One burst, and the bomb beneath its fuselage detonated mid-air, scattering fire like shrapnel across the clouds. Ortiz's voice followed seconds later. "Got one! She's going down!" But for every kill, new enemies appeared. Zeros swarmed from above, twisting through the chaos. One slipped onto Ortiz's tail, guns blazing. "Skipper, I've got one on me!" Harrington rolled hard, dove through a cloud bank, and came down fast, guns hammering. The Zero burst into flame, gone before it hit the sea. All across the fleet, the same deadly ballet unfolded. Hellcats streaked in from every direction, striking with precision and vanishing into the clouds. Below, American gunners unleashed walls of flak, filling the sky with black bursts that tore through the Japanese formations. The second wave broke apart just as violently as the first. Yet even amid the slaughter, there were moments of heartbreaking bravery. Some Japanese pilots pressed on through the storm of gunfire, trying desperately to reach the carriers. One torpedo plane, riddled with holes, managed to release its payload before disintegrating into the sea. The torpedo missed by 100 yards, leaving only a ripple in the water. To the men watching from the deck, it was a symbol of a dying force still trying to fight the impossible. By noon, the second wave was shattered. The horizon shimmered with rising smoke, and the radio crackled with a new report that sent a chill through every cockpit. Third formation inbound. Estimated strength, 80 aircraft. Harrington exhaled slowly. "They're throwing everything," he said. "This is it, their last shot." As the third wave appeared, the difference was clear. These weren't veteran pilots anymore. Many flew unevenly, some too high, others too low, breaking formation before the fight even began. Still, they came, driven by duty, by desperation, by the belief that dying for the Emperor was victory enough. The Hellcats tore through them in minutes. Harrington destroyed a bomber with a single burst. Ortiz downed 2 more before his guns jammed. In less than an hour, it was over. The third wave disintegrated under the onslaught, leaving the sky littered with falling smoke trails and drifting parachutes. And then at last, the sky began to fall quiet again. The fourth wave, small, ragged, barely 50 aircraft, never even reached the fleet. They were met far out to sea and erased in moments. When the last enemy plane vanished beneath the clouds, a strange stillness settled over the Pacific. The radio was silent. The engines hummed low. Harrington looked down at the endless ocean below, an ocean now filled with wreckage, fire, and ghosts. "It's done," Ortiz said quietly. "They're finished." Harrington didn't answer. He just stared at the horizon, where smoke curled into the sky like the last breath of a dying empire. The air still smelled of cordite and salt, and beneath the roar of engines you could almost hear the echo of the men who would never return. By mid-afternoon, the Pacific was unrecognizable. Smoke hung in thick gray veils across the horizon. Oil burned on the waves, glowing like molten glass beneath the sun. The once clear blue sky was streaked with trails of vapor, ash, and flame. For hours, the roar of engines and the crackle of gunfire had been constant, unrelenting. But now, suddenly, there was silence. The radios that had once buzzed with shouted orders and kill calls were quiet. No more enemy squadrons, no more radar contacts. It was as if the sky itself had finally run out of breath. Lieutenant Commander David Harrington circled above the fleet, scanning the horizon. Nothing. Not a single red circle remained in the air. He keyed his mic softly. "Control, this is Hammer Lead. Sky's clear." The reply came back calm, steady, almost disbelieving. "Copy that, Hammer Lead. All units return to base." Below, the sea told the story better than any after-action report ever could. Miles of wreckage drifted aimlessly, broken wings, shattered fuselages, empty life rafts. The waves were littered with debris and oil, the remains of hundreds of aircraft that would never return to their carriers. Here and there, parachutes floated on the water, some with men still clinging to them, others already empty. American destroyers moved carefully among the wreckage, picking up survivors, Japanese and American alike. For every pilot rescued, a dozen more were gone. From above, the ocean looked like a graveyard. Harrington's engine hummed steadily, but his chest felt hollow. "God," Ortiz whispered over the radio, "look at it all." Harrington didn't answer. He couldn't. There was no triumph in what he saw, only awe and a heavy silence that words couldn't touch. When the pilots returned to their carriers, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Mechanics rushed to meet them, clapping shoulders, counting bullet holes, refueling for a fight that was already over. On the flight decks, men cheered and shouted, but even their victory felt muted. Numbers began to circulate. Nearly 400 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 4 full waves of attack wiped from the sky, while the Americans had lost fewer than 30 planes. It was staggering, beyond staggering. It wasn't just a victory, it was a collapse. The moment Japan's air arm ceased to exist as a fighting force. The Hellcat had done what it was built to do: survive, strike, and dominate. But as the cheers faded, the cost became clear. Not for America, but for the men who had fought against them, many of them boys barely old enough to shave, trained for weeks, not years, and sent into the teeth of a storm they couldn't escape. As night fell over the fleet, the horizon still glowed faintly with burning oil. The sea hissed and sizzled where wreckage still smoldered. On the carrier decks, pilots sat in silence, helmets at their feet, hands shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. Harrington leaned against the rail, staring out into the darkness. He had seen victory before, but never like this. The stars above were cold and clear, utterly indifferent to the fire below. Ortiz joined him quietly. "We broke them," he said. Harrington nodded slowly. "Yeah, we did." But his voice carried no triumph, only fatigue, and a strange, quiet sorrow, because he understood what the silence meant. Japan's air power had been shattered beyond repair. The war in the Pacific had just entered a new phase, one where the skies no longer belonged to two nations, but to one. The day the sky fell silent was not just an ending, it was the beginning of the end. That evening, the carriers of Task Force 58 glowed under the soft orange of the setting sun. The air smelled of oil, cordite, and salt, the perfume of victory and exhaustion. On the flight deck of the USS Independence, the roar of engines had faded to a low hum. Mechanics moved quietly among the aircraft, patching bullet holes and counting scars. Some Hellcats bore dozens of hits, yet still stood proud, paint scorched and wings torn but unbroken, like the men who flew them. Pilots climbed down from their cockpits with trembling hands, faces pale under layers of grime. Some grinned through the fatigue. Others just stared, silent, their minds still caught in the blur of tracer fire and screams over the radio. The battle had ended, but its echo hadn't. Not yet. In the mess hall, the atmosphere teetered between disbelief and relief. Laughter bubbled up, uneven, nervous, almost guilty. Someone banged a tin mug against a table. Someone else began humming a tune from home. Lieutenant Commander Harrington sat near the back, his flight gear still half on, listening. Across from him, Ortiz devoured a plate of rations like a man who hadn't eaten in days. 400, Ortiz muttered between bites. 400 planes gone. You think that's real? Harrington nodded slowly. It's real, and it means something big. Around them, the room buzzed with stories, each pilot reliving their moment of terror, of triumph, of near death. It felt surreal, like they'd stepped out of a storm into another world. Later that night, Captain Walter Green gathered the squadron in the hangar bay. His voice, usually rough and commanding, was quiet, reverent. "Gentlemen," he said, Today we destroyed Japan's carrier air arm. Not crippled, not weakened, destroyed. The room fell still. Nearly 400 enemy aircraft lost, less than 30 of ours. The numbers speak for themselves. No one cheered. No one needed to. The victory was too enormous, too heavy to celebrate. It wasn't just a battle. It was a turning point. Harrington felt it in his bones. This day would be remembered long after the war was over, long after the Hellcats had rusted into history. Outside, the Pacific stretched dark and endless, the faint glow of burning oil still smudging the horizon. Harrington walked the deck later, alone. The wind was cool now, carrying only the soft hiss of waves against steel. He leaned on the railing, watching the black water slip past. Somewhere out there floated the wreckage of hundreds of aircraft, the remnants of an empire's dream of dominance. He thought of the Japanese pilots, boys, really, who had gone up that morning believing in a myth, and how quickly that myth had burned away. We broke them today, he whispered to himself. And yet, he felt no joy, only a kind of weary awe. The war had turned. The United States now owned the Pacific sky, and there was no going back. For Harrington, Ortiz, and every man aboard those carriers, the victory was both triumph and burden. The realization that supremacy had come at the cost of so many young lives, lost to the sea and the silence that followed. The morning after the battle, the Pacific was calm again. The fires had burned down to embers, and the horizon stretched clean and blue as if nothing had happened. But beneath that still surface floated the wreckage of an empire's pride. In a single day, Japan had lost nearly 400 aircraft, dozens of veteran pilots, and the last hope of challenging American dominance in the air. From that day forward, the skies belonged to the Hellcat. It wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol, a product of every lesson, every loss, every scar earned since Pearl Harbor. What began in smoke and humiliation had ended in mastery. The Pacific, once Japan's domain, was now America's highway to victory. By the end of the war, the F6F Hellcat would earn its place in legend. Over 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed, a kill ratio of 19-1. No other fighter in history would claim such a record in such a short span. But numbers only tell part of the story. The true legacy of the Hellcat wasn't its speed or firepower. It was what it represented. It was proof that determination could outbuild despair, that innovation could outfly fear. Every rivet, every bullet hole, every pilot who returned alive was a testament to a system that had learned how to adapt, how to endure, and how to win. For Japan, the loss was more than physical. It was spiritual. Its greatest aces were gone, its myth of invincibility shattered. New pilots would come, but they were boys flying relics against an unstoppable tide. The empire that had once dominated the Pacific now faced the slow, inevitable unraveling of its power. For America, the battle was a revelation. It wasn't luck or divine favor. It was preparation, discipline, and sheer industrial momentum. The war had shifted from heroism to machinery, from individual aces to collective efficiency. The Hellcat, forged in steel and driven by thousands of unseen hands back home, had become the embodiment of modern warfare itself. When the war finally ended, it was Hellcats that circled above Tokyo Bay as Japan signed its surrender aboard the USS Missouri. Their wings glinted in the sunlight, silent witnesses to the end of an era. Lieutenant Commander Harrington was there, watching from the deck, the echo of engines still ringing in his memory. He remembered the roar, the fire, the young faces that never came back. He remembered the silence that followed victory. As he looked out over the calm Pacific, he understood what history would never forget. The age of the Zero was over, and a new world had begun. The Hellcat wasn't just a plane. It was a promise kept, a message carved into the sky. That courage, when matched with resolve, could change the course of the world.